What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. Let's talk about 9.2 coming out for League of Legends. By the time you watch this video, it's probably already live. I had a long day, so let's get right into it. A lot of people online are calling 9.2 the real preseason patch, which I do kind of get because there's so many champion changes, and indeed the jungle was a bit nerfed as well. I don't disagree. This is obviously a very, very large patch. What I will say is that I think people are kind of underselling how big 823 was, and I don't know, I thought that was a pretty big preseason patch itself, but either way, we're here on 9.2. It is going to shake things up quite a bit. The ranked season is going to be starting. That's a big deal here. Season start. Get your ranks. I'm going to be playing probably Phil main for this entire season. I'm actually really intrigued to see how I can do across all the roles. Now that positional ranking is finally a thing. I was hearing about it for several years. It's finally coming out. I'm excited about that. I want to play lots of stuff. That's going to be really cool. I urge you to try as well and see how it goes for you. I'm going to have some other game modes coming up. Stay tuned. That's cool. Silas is coming out. He looks super sweet. As always, I don't cover champions in the patch rundown, but that's going to be super cool. Champion Spotlight should be out pretty soon if it's not already, so that'll be fun. Stay tuned for that. Let's talk about the actual changes, though, to the champions. Up first is Aatrox. Aatrox has been a reasonably strong mid and top laner. Win rate wise is basically exactly 50%. Certainly people like to complain about champions even if they are at a pretty reasonable overall pick rate. That's fine. He's definitely fairly strong. He's a pretty huge champion in pro play as well. I think it's completely fine to nerf him. Either way, essentially the base damage is the same, but keep in mind that with the ratio going down, it is a total attack damage ratio, which is basically indirectly a base damage nerf because his own base stats get nerfed down with it, or his base stats turn into base damage essentially, and that ratio is going down, so the damage is lower. Also, Umbral Dash has got 2 more seconds on the cooldown. So here's the Q damage before and after. The base damage is down about 10%. That flattens out to about 4% as higher rank ups diminish the nerf, and also there's more damage from the base damage coming in. You can see the difference in the attack damage ratio. Starts at minus 14%, ends at minus 6. The more attack damage you buy, the bigger the nerf is. Either way, this is pretty substantial. I wouldn't be surprised if Aatrox lost a good 2% win rate or maybe more off of this. That's going to be enough to put Aatrox as not a great solo queue pick, and he will be less seen in pro, though we probably still see him some, but this is a pretty substantial nerf. Even though it might not look that big on paper, when you lose 10% of your damage, that's a big nerf. Next up are big changes to Aurelion Sol. You can recast the Q sooner, but if you do so, the stun is a lot shorter. However, if the Q goes for a long distance, it will travel farther and stun for longer. The stun duration was basically at the outer limit if standing still, so anything shorter than that you can recast but get less stun, or if you go for the long range stun it does more. So those big long cross map Qs can stun for about twice as much, and that seems pretty cool. So cool for Aurelion Sol, good stuff there. Overall, Aurelion Sol seems to be functioning fine. Certainly he's not a super popular champion, and usually when Aurelion Sol is like balanced and thus everyone feels good about the champion, he tends to be really, really high win rate. So Aurelion Sol is probably stronger as a result of these changes, almost definitely. And thus will gain, I'm going to say like maybe 1% win rate here. You could see the win rate dip if people who are bad at Aurelion Sol pick up the champion. That kind of stuff can definitely happen. I wouldn't be shocked if the win rate did in fact go down, but these should still be buffs to the character. Next up is Brand. Brand is getting some small nerfs to his passive. The generic burn is going from 4% down to 3%. As usual, his support role is better than his mid lane role, because of course it is. If you watched my big video on base stats a little while back, almost nothing in bottom lane has magic resist, so any of these high AP damage mages tend to just eviscerate real supports because they have a lot of armor and not a lot of health. Lo and behold, Brand and Zyra are really, really good in those champions. So Brand and Zyra are like the best supports in the game. No one should be really surprised about this. Either way, 25% haircut to the damage per stack on Blaze. The AP ratio and everything else is staying the same. This will generally nerf support Brand more than mid lane Brand, as mid lane Brand can rely on AP ratios and higher ranks on the abilities to do more damage. But it'll probably drop mid Brand below 50%, and support Brand will be just above. Next up is Cassiopeia. She is definitely far too strong right now. Super high win rate in 3 different roles, top, mid, and bot. She is incredibly, incredibly good. And the big sort of pattern that people do now is Q max into W max. You keep people at arm's length all the time. And the E Twin Fang is more of an afterthought. So the Q damage got nerfed a little while ago to make that rank up worse. Now they're nerfing the W rank up, which honestly I kind of like. It's not going to drop her below 50%. Cassie will still be an incredibly strong champion that people are going to want to play in solo queue and in pro, but gaining 2 seconds cooldown on Miasma, losing 20 DPS on the W as well, those are definitely going to matter. Those are definitely going to matter. I don't believe I actually... Oh yeah, here's the cooldown table on the Aatrox E, by the way. And I did at least include the damage difference and cooldown difference on this ability. This is how much worse it is. The damage eventually goes down by a full quarter. Though I'm including the full duration here, the percentages are the same, regardless of, you know, whether it's 1 tick or 5 ticks. It's all going to be the same percentages. Cooldown only 14% longer is not that big of a deal. So this is kind of much smaller of a nerf, but the W damage going down by a fairly substantial margin should mean quite a lot, because it really does do a lot of damage, and it is a pretty substantial haircut to the damage output. When you see, you know, 80 becomes 60, you don't think it's very much, but the fact that it's truly a 25% damage cut does mean a lot. Cass, again, will still be very, very strong. There's probably going to need to be some follow-up work on this champion, but this is not a trivial nerf to the character. Next up, big nerfs to Galio, who truly, truly needed them. In retrospect, I think I organized my charts in kind of a bad way. I should have separated burst damage versus tornado damage as opposed to like flat versus percent health. That would have told a better picture of how much this character had really changed back in the previous patch. Certainly, he is far too strong. Galio is a solid 53.5% win rate in the mid lane and 51.5% in the top lane. He's doing really, really, really well. So nerf to the mana cost on the Q, nerf the damage in the Q, nerf the AP ratio on the Q, nerf the AP ratio on the tornado on the Q, and then even 20 damage off the E. Well, 20 damage on rank 1 off the E, because you tend to max it last. So here is the Q damage difference. If you were to just hit the first half of the Q straight up, that's the part that got nerfed, bam, it does 20 less damage by the end of the rank, so about a 9% damage cut at level 9 on the character. And the ratio, of course, is down 17% as well. The ratio on the tornadoes got halved. We saw that there. This is pretty substantial. But let's compare present-day Galio to old Galio before the overbuff. Before this character got buffed way, way too high. What was it before? What is it now? And this is the way, again, I think I should have done the math in the first place. What does Q1 do? What does Q2 do? Well, Q1 is still better than before. And this is after the nerf on the Q. Back before the changes, it did 50 to 170, and it was all in the tornado. Now, there's still a lot in the upfront burst, and that's 25% more damage than before. That is really substantial. Now, again, the ratio is still a bit lower. Down about 6%, 0.8 became 0.75. Keep in mind that before this, it was a 0.9 ratio, so the base damage was up and the ratio was up. That's where a lot of the damage is coming in, and I missed that because of how I organized my data, and that's on my bad. The other half, though, is the tornado itself. And what I chose to do here was pick basically a generic example target that scales from like 600-ish to 2200-ish health, because a bunch of flat percent health damage on Q2 now. And if that is indeed your target, this is the damage difference. The flat damage, both on the first hit and the tornado, is higher than before all the changes ever went in. Now, keep in mind, again, this is assuming you're hitting a high health champion. So against things like cast minis, you're not having quite that same value, but PvP damage is like this. What I will point out, though, is that before all of these changes went through, the actual AP ratio on the tornado has been hit really, really, really hard. Now, that said, old Galio had a really high ratio on Q2. That's been nerfed pretty substantially. But this is basically what it is now. That before all the changes to Galio, when the R no longer gives damage reduction, where the R has less knockup in the middle, all these changes, the E not doing full damage to minions. From before to now, the flat damage, the upfront damage is higher. The AP ratios are lower. So there is more value in playing Galio as a tank. And that's what I seem to see Reddit complaining about, is Galio's being played as pure mage. Well, here you go. These are essentially, the overall changes are Galio has more upfront damage and lower AP ratios. So there we go. That's happening, getting him back a little bit more towards the tank, which is good. And these nerfs, as you can see up here, should be big enough to drop him quite a few percent. This should be a pretty big deal. considering that the rest of the changes to the kit that weren't to the Q were pretty much all nerfs in E damage to minions and wave clear, and what your R does to people. This should be a fairly large difference overall, and Gallia should be back below. I mean, it's hard to say because like I don't feel like these nerfs are big enough to put him below 50%, but also knowing what Gallia was before these changes and how I would say reasonably close the character is, considering the other things that got nerfed off the kit, I want to say Gallia is going to be in a fairly balanced state, but I don't know. I think he'll still be above 50%, and he'll still be a really big solo queue pick, and he'll still be played in pro. That's my ultimate read. Next up, changes to Aurelia. No longer gets the bonus damage to shields at max stacks. That's a big thing. I'm pretty sure the only part that did bonus damage to shields was the actual passive damage itself. It didn't make like, oh, with 4 stacks on passive, all your damage is bonus to shields. It was just the passive itself did a bit more to shields, but hey, that's gone. I think that's actually totally reasonable to get rid of that on the kit. That seems fine. The other big change is Blade Surge no longer deals double damage to minions. It has a flat bonus damage here instead, which just tends to be a pretty big nerf overall in the damage output. Now keep in mind, this is not including her buying any items, which would further nerf what this ability did because it had a bigger AD ratio before than after. Ultimately, this means she's got worse wave clear in the mid game, in the late game. She can't eviscerate minion waves quite as fast. That'll be a fairly big deal. Now, keep in mind, this character was already doing not super great. You had to be good at Irelia to do well in the champion. It's like a 45, 46% win rate character. I really don't think you needed to ban this character or do anything about it, but hey, she's going to be even worse now. Next up, Vanguard's Edge no longer gains duration on rank up. The slow is bigger, but you lose the disarm, but you gain 50 to 100 damage on the wall. I could easily see this being honestly a buff, because I think a lot of people just simply run away through the wall and keep running, so now they don't run as far and they take more damage. It's cool they can still stand their ground. I think this is a good thing. I think this is a good change design-wise to make the character feel less frustrated. You can feel like you can fight back a little bit more. That's a good thing. But I don't think this change is really that much of a straight nerf. It's going to be a good feels gain for people who are against the champion, though. So this is a cool change. I like this. You're not stuck in this pit for so long and whatnot else. Next up, buffs to Jarvan's attack speed. Flat 5% gain, double to 10% when you cast the flag. That's going to be nice. Jarvan was in an okay spot. He's 50%-ish, both jungle and top. He'll gain about 1% from this and will be a reasonable pick. Next up is Jax. Everyone loves to hate Jax, and he's certainly doing really far too well. What's funny is he... because he's getting so popular and people who are bad at Jax are playing him, he's not actually smashing matchups that hard. He's in an overall 51% win rate. Not to say Jax isn't overtuned, I do think he is, but he's actually not smashing as hard as someone like, let's say, Cassio would be. Not that Cassio's balanced either, don't get me wrong, but like, people love to hate trend on characters that are not actually bashing your face in that much, is what I'm going to say about that. Either way, losing about 2 attack damage, losing 15 damage off the Q. People are memeing about how little this nerf looks. I think it's actually a pretty reasonable nerf. This will probably drop him a solid like 1.5%, which if everyone's just playing him nonstop because he's like the flavor of the month, he's going to be sub 50 win rate. Now, not by much. And like, look, if you don't like to use win rates to determine whether or not a champion is strong or not, that's fine. Just keep in mind that he's going to lose more games than he wins. You just shouldn't ban him. He's going to lose more than he wins. I don't have much else to say. What's of note, though, is that his jungle win rate is actually super, super duper high, especially in lower elo, where he just kind of hard farms. And he's going to lose a bit because of this. He's going to lose a lot more because of the jungle changes. Hard farming junglers are going to get worse in this patch, and we'll get to that later on. Either way, yes, they could have gone harder on Jax, but I don't personally think he's actually that stupidly, absurdly out of line. Like, I don't think he needs to be just gutterballed, but that's opinion. Next up is Kassadin. Kassadin is definitely in too strong of a spot right now, about 51.5%, 52% in both top and mid. What's pretty crazy, he seems like he's getting to be a little bit blind pickable, that because he doesn't have bad enough matchups, you can just pick him every single game and do pretty well no matter what. Kassadin definitely deserves to be in a counter pick sort of world, so I do like that they're saying, hey, you know what, this champion should be weak against physical damage. Your base armor is low, your armor growth is low. Here is the math on how much physical durability he has now afterwards. It's down 4 to 6%. That's pretty meaningful. For those of you who watched my video on base stats, though, what I would have liked to see instead was essentially rejiggering on a lot of his numbers, because it's not a problem, I don't think, that Kassadin is going to have exceptionally low armor. 67 is quite low, which really means that he is weak to things like Talon, anyone who's going to build physical damage lethality. It is extra good against him. But I would have still liked to see him being opened up to early game harassment by using the passive as the anti-magic damage and allowing his stats to grow in a more normal way. It's not that big of a deal. It's very fiddly. It's not worth going into. You can watch my video about it if you want to know more of my thoughts on base stats, whatnot. But either way, I mean, this is fine. I think it's directionally still a good idea. Kassadin is the anti-mage, so we should lose some armor or be more vulnerable to physical damage. Round numbers is always nice as well. So, can't hate too much. I think it's a good change. I think it's the right change in general to make this the weakness. So that's cool. Next up is Cain. Cain's doing pretty well. First of all, world champion jungler Ning is playing Cain a lot, so as much as people want to meme on this character, he's clearly functional. Basically, they're doing really big changes to how the passive works. That basically what it comes down to is you gain points overall from any champion type. Whether you're hitting melee or ranged, those go into essentially the same pool, and when you get 500 points, you evolve. And as long as you're not hitting the same types of champions really close together and you're going back and forth, you just simply get the form that you were fastest at, the form that you did more damage towards. But if they're close to even, and we can read through all this, essentially what it means is you've got more clarity on how close you are to transforming. You get to dodge the concern that Xenon was talking about, how, I'm going to go to bat real quick about, Xenon trying to sort of obscure the mechanics on transforming. And I think, to be fair, this is a better implementation of that goal. The goal, to my understanding, was to not put players in this finicky spot where they were like, oh, I don't want to gank bot lane, because if I gank bot lane, I'll get the wrong transform, and that's not what I want, so I'm going to ignore team objectives for selfish ones. I think that is noble to try to say, no, Cain, you don't get the info to make that choice. I think that is a good thing to say, hey, no. You should gank because ganking is good. Don't make these choices. It's bad for League of Legends. I think that is a defensible design choice. But this set of changes, which lets everything succeed in pushing the champion forward, and then giving you that choice, in a more easily approached way, or say, okay, now I'm close, let's go top push over the edge. That is, I think, more stomachable, more palatable, and is sort of the better iteration of those sorts of goals. So I don't dislike the goals that were initially set with the sort of obfuscation of the passive, but I think this is better design overall. Here's your transformation clarity. It's a bunch of cool stuff. Either way, it's going to be cooler for Cain. That's fun that you can recall during the E. Okay, you get some extra range on R for Shadow Assassin, some bug fixes, cool stuff there. Again, Cain's doing generally fine. This is gonna be a lot of feels goods, and I think it's actually buff his win rate a fair bit. He's probably gonna go up. I'm gonna guess 1 to 2%, maybe even more because of this. This could really make Cain insane. Just getting probably faster transforms, more reliable transforms. Cain only really loses if he fails to transform in a reasonable amount of time, and this is gonna help that a lot. Next up are small changes to Niko. Buff to the clone and haste duration. It's going to have slightly cooler AI, which is nice. You can use the Shapesplitter's passive, Shapesplitter passive on turrets to deal more damage. Then that's kind of nice as well. What's interesting though is you are losing the slow on R, but you pop up faster. I don't really know the timing difference here for if this lets people get out more easily or not. But essentially, it's just a faster cast. You can surprise people a bit more. I think this will end up being an actual buff to the character, which is good because Niko is not in that great of a spot. She is fairly low win rate in most roles. Really, the only roles you should really be playing her in are the solo lanes. She's like 48.5 mid lane. It's not too bad, but people are playing her a lot in support. She is a weak support, and that is tanking her overall win rate. She's not a good support. Don't play her there. Mid lane, she's pretty solid, though. Next up, buffs to Ornn, and by gosh, does Ornn need it. He has climbed up a little bit post-patch. People kind of learned how to play him a bit more, but the overall change of the character, because of the loss on shield, because of a bit of the things that were lost to the character, all the crazy AoE crowd control that's gotten a lot worse, he ended up getting quite a bit weaker. So he's getting some extra baseline tankiness. Hashtag clean numbers is nice, and I do like where these numbers are going. These are sort of the right direction for like, hey, these are the kinds of base stats tanks should really have. Here is Ornn's health and his overall physical durability as a result of the armor buffs. Solid 4 to 1% extra health is pretty reasonable. 7 to 3% overall physical durability is pretty solid as well. And these are, non-trivial buffs to his durability. Should help him in landing phase, should help him in team fights. I really think you could go farther. 100 is a pretty reasonable spot to stop for a tank, but 2200, I think you can go higher than that for a tank, honestly. Especially without self-shielding, you could probably add another 5, 10 health per level, and I think it would still be reasonable, and that's actually what I would do if I had, like, solo control of characters. Again, talk about that in another video. But overall, this is still pretty cool. Cool changes. He's still going to be on the weak side for solo queue. That said, people love to say that Ornn is broken when he's at, like, 47% win rate, so he's not winning solo queue games. He still won't that much here, but this will get him pretty close to being in pro, I think. Next up, nerfs to Rakan. He's losing 4 armor. His W is getting slower, but the knockup is faster, which ultimately means the same thing. It will mean that point blank W is going to be way quicker, which is a straight up buff in a lot of other cases. Like if you like E to your Ornn in the front line and then W point blank, you're going to stun sooner. Yeah, max range casts are slightly later. Short range casts hit faster. It's still pretty close. There is some bug fixes to the R, so there's going to be some minor buffs here that like are going to affect the champion. But overall, certainly Rakan was losing a fair bit of games. His win rate's not that bad though. He's at like 48.5. So I was seeing Reddit like make fun of Rakan being really weak and then like being unplayable, but he's not in that bad of a spot. Overall physical durability goes down 2 to 3%, which isn't huge, but I'm glad to see him under 100 armor, honestly. I think his base stats are out of line, and he's skewed too heavily towards blocking physical. His health could have gone up. His MR could be kind of tempered towards the middle a little bit, and I think that would have been fine because he is so short range, but oh well, he's going to get blown up by spells again. Either way, he'll lose, I think, a little bit overall as a character. And he'll go down a bit in pro priority, but not a ton. He will remain sub 50 in solo queue. Next up, buffs to Shyvana. Shyvana is not in a great spot. She is sub 49 in kind of all the roles that she plays. I do like that her flavor is going up, right? She is the hard farm jungler who can solo the major objectives and do good damage there because of how much persistent damage he has. So I like this is going up. Keep in mind that Drakes are worth more on Summoner's Rift than they were last season because the first 2 Drakes across all Drake types do more for your characters. So I don't really think people should completely sell this short. I think this is pretty valuable. I think it does mean quite a bit. And overall, her Flame Breath doing more damage on auto attacks is a pretty substantial damage buff. So this is the math here. This is assuming she was landing her own basic attack in the damage and picking a sort of similar target to Shyvana herself as the target of opportunity. And getting a pretty reasonable 6 to 9% extra damage. This, of course, goes down the more items she has. This is essentially flat damage on the ability because there's no way that she can scale it up by herself. But hey, it lets you play more of tank Shyvana. You can buy less damage items and still get some damage out of the kit. Again, you're still better at killing Drakes. And keep in mind, this double dips, right? You do more damage to it and you do more damage to it. So she's even better at hunting those targets down. This could be pretty meaningful. I really do think so. I think the Flame Breath damage is capped, so maybe this doesn't actually affect your Drake damage in any meaningful way, but either way, this still does, and I think it still does matter. But she does need buffs. This won't put her up to 50%, but I don't think Shyvana needs to live at 50% to be fair in League of Legends. She tends to be fairly uninteractive, so I think her being at like 49 is a good spot to sit, personally. That's how I feel. Next up, Tahm Kench is a champion that really only sees pro play. He is really quite weak in solo queue. Sadly, the moves to make the queue more spammable, do a bit more damage in dedicated combat, has made his top lane a bit better. He's about a 48% top laner, which isn't too bad, actually. He actually wins more than Ornn, for example. Yeah, getting rid of some of those sort of kitschy save your teammates in a team fight stuff that was mostly pro facing, and these kinds of changes are really good to have. I think that I am glad Riot's doing more to try to bridge the gap between solo queue and pro. This helps do that. I think it's a positive. He's still going to be really weak in solo queue. You'll see a little bit less of him in pro play, but he's still generically viable because turns out Tahm Kench does things that are good in pro. Next up, nerfs to Urgot, who does, in fact, need them. He is a fairly high win rate top laner, only 51%. Honestly, I mean, he was sleeper for a while. Definitely does deserve some nerfs here. He's a big pick in pro play as well. Good to see him go down a little bit. Losing 3 armor, losing 10 mana, and losing a fair bit of cooldown on the ability he maxes second. So here's that table. His physical durability down only 2 to 1%. I mean, this guy has absurdly high armor gain. And even though he does get melee champion MR growth, he is still heavily skewed towards blocking physical damage. Which means you should, like, it's weird because playing mages against him is a little awkward. Because he is so durable with just his health and his shield that it's hard to run him down with mages, but he is better against AD than he is against AP. That's just the skew. And we were seeing Lissandra against him a fair bit, and that was kind of rightly so. His durability was still heavily in armor and still is with the 108. But the W cooldown being quite a bit higher does mean a lot. I mean, 30% higher for the first 7 levels is a very substantial cut to his durability. If he pops it to go aggressive, it's going to be down for a very long time if you trade back. That's going to be the biggest of all the nerfs here. This is quite a big deal. You will have many, many more windows to trade against him. I would not be surprised if Urgot dropped below 50% as a result. Next up, buffs to Volibear, and I know people love to make fun of Volibear for being weak. He's not really in that bad of a spot, though, overall. Honestly, he's really close to 50%, and I think these buffs are enough to tip him over 50, and he will be a viable champion. And yeah, I think he's worth playing in solo queue. I'll be willing to play Volibear in my ranked games this season. So first off, really, really big buff to the damage on the E, the bonus damage on the E, if they're mid-flip or knocked up in some other way. If they're trying to dash away from you like they're jacks, you try to interrupt that, or if you're trying to combo off your own flip. This is a really, really substantial damage buff. So here is the data table. E is an ability you tended to max last. Before it would do 100 total damage, but it ranked up a lot to 360 by max rank. Now, even at rank 1, the damage that it provides from the percent max HP is already an upgrade, but because the percent max health damage will keep scaling up without ranking up the ability, you get some really, really substantial damage gains around this level 13 mark of 90% or so. And that can be, of course, higher if they're tankier targets, and of course less so if they're less tanky targets, like, you know, a Vayne who's under-leveled. But it is a really, and you can kind of see the damage difference. Like, you're going to get like 50 or 60 more damage on your combo, which is super not trivial. That is a very substantial bump in damage. Getting up to 90 more is a pretty big deal. That's a pretty big deal. So this does mean a lot if you can get the knocked up target combo out. And you're going to get it sometimes. That's going to be pretty nice. Compensation for the AP ratio goes on to the R. The first lightning bolt comes out a little bit sooner when you cast it. The chain lightning comes out bursty as well. My understanding was the delays, at least on hit, was to make it a bit more visceral, like doo, 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 doo. But now instead it's just going to be all instant. You're going to get all your damage right away. This probably makes it a bit more reliable. Hopefully it still does feel good to use, but hey, Thunderclaws is a cool thing. You're going to be your big Juggernaut bear. Should be pretty solid. This seems pretty decent. One of the things I do want to point out, by the way, is some of the context behind this change is, they're saying, you know, Volibear really is more of a Juggernaut than he is a diver. And if you're playing a diver role, like you're playing Vi or something, or a Nocturne, you want flat damage because you tend to be hitting squishy targets. But if you're a Juggernaut, and you're playing someone like Darius or Volibear in this case, you tend to be hitting other frontliners. You're hitting the Nautiluses and Orns and whatnot that exist. And so percent health damage is your damage type against that, where they have 1,000 more health than backline targets. So you're doing 50% more damage with ability than you would against other backline targets. So this is giving him the damage typing of Juggernauts because you are hitting frontline by playing this character. I think that's correct because that is really what you're seeing here. I could, by the way, totally see Thunderclaws having percent damage on it at some point as well. We'll see if it ever happens, but I could see it. Next up is Yorick. Yorick he's doing okay, honestly. He's still 50% win rate, slightly above it. Like, he's not in that bad of a spot, but he is getting some buffs to make it feel better. Ultimately, it's a pun because it's his ultimate. He's getting the ability to use the Maiden split pushing a little bit differently. Ghouls are going to spawn more frequently from 12.8.4 to 12.6.2. So at level 7 and onwards, basically in the later game levels, he's going to get ghouls and graves a lot more frequently. Quick bug fix on the E is nice. And then here's some math on the R. It's going to have a lot more health, and you can reactivate it to set the Maiden free, but you can't get it back when that happens. She's just going to side push forever. Here is the Yorick Maiden Health. It is essentially always higher. It takes like 25 at level 6 bonus HP to make it a buff, and it takes like 200 at level 17 to make it a buff. So in all cases, Maiden has more health, and the ratio is 2.3x as large, so Maiden is going to be tankier. This split push beast is going to be around a lot longer, do a lot more stuff, and they're not going to deal decreased damage when far from Yorick as well, so he's going to get a lot more benefit out of using it as a split pusher. Now, he is not a good team fighter without his ultimate, don't get me wrong. That's still very weak, but if he needs to like 1-3-1 by himself and make it a 1-4-1 essentially, send the Maiden one way, send himself the other, that's going to get more done in the sidelines, and he can get a bit more done, and that, you know, should buff him a little bit. So for those times you really need to split push with yourself, you're going to have that a bit more. Next up is Zyra, who, much like Brand, is far, far, far too strong. She is super duper duper broken because magic damage is really, really high in the bottom lane. And so she's losing some mana regen. And it's a little bit of mana regen. It matters a little bit. She's losing 15 to 11% of her MP5. And this is the mana per minute. So you can kind of see how much she really gets. Because all the mana regen items that Zyra buys in the support role, because all those items are percent mana regen, spell thieves and whatnot, this will kind of fall in line along the same percentages. So this will be a fairly noticeable drop in her power level. Keep in mind that she got all the usability buffs in the previous couple of patches. So yeah, this means a fair bit. Bug fixes to Evelyn. You can spam Q and it's going to buffer through ping, which is nice. No longer fizzles, which is really great because this was super annoying. This is going to go off a lot more often, and I love that because, oh my gosh, this was really annoying as someone who played Evelyn some. Your E's going to have more consistent drops for you, and you can now buffer the R through your E, which is super cool. So these are going to be pretty nice for Evelyn. And Evelyn was already, I feel like, in a fairly decent spot. I'm looking up her win rate right about now, and it didn't seem like she was in too bad of a spot, but, you know, slightly above 50%. You know, reasonably okay champion. Not overpowered by any means, but she's going to gain a fair bit here. I'm going to guess maybe 0.5% to maybe 1.2. We'll be on the strong side of junglers. I think that's fine. Small thing that already happened with Kled. His E won't clump minis together anymore, so you can kind of pick them out and last hit them more easily. It'll make it a little bit harder to use your Q and Titanic to kill them, but oh well, they're just not going to pull them together anymore. A lot of long range abilities are going to not get targeted on the minimap anymore, so you don't accidentally cast them the wrong way. This is a buff to Lux, buff to Nami. It's probably a good thing. That's cool. Next up, glad they're doing this, and actually as I looked at some of the numbers, I was surprised that they were as efficient as they were. Nerfs to Oblivion Orb by 100 gold and 5 AP, and nerfs to Merlinomicon by 10 AP. So here is this table right now. On the left-hand side is what the items used to be, on the right-hand side is what they are now. Oblivion Orb used to be fully gold efficient as a mid-tier item. Now, what's interesting is most mid-tier items tend to be about 100% gold efficient. And Magic Pen was costed appropriately, comparing it to, say, Sorcerer's Shoes. You're paying the same amount for that much Magic Pen. That is the fair cost analysis for this item. So it wasn't that Oblivion Orb was technically overpowered or overstated, but the problem is that getting flat Magic Pen that early is just super duper valuable. That's just actually, I mean, ultimately it's just absurdly strong that when no one has gained any extra MR yet, it's a really, really big power spike. And so this getting pushed back a bit by 100 gold means you don't spike quite as early. And it being pushed back by 5 AP means it's getting, you have less sort of overall ability damage to carry through with that Magic Pen. So this is a fairly big nerf. If you're still trying to be an assassin, you're still going to go Oblivion Orb, but you're going to feel this nerf. Merlinomicon overall, though, this is the one that surprised me a bit more. I don't think these items needed to be so efficient. It was already gold efficient before the Grievous Wounds. Now you're at least paying 211 gold for Grievous Wounds. That feels a bit more reasonable, dropping it down to 70 AP. And I do think that shaping the items in nerfing their ability power because the Magic Pen is doing the carrying is the right choice. You don't get to have your cake and eat it too. It's if your base damages are good enough, you do more damage to squishies, but the AP is not going to carry it. So at least that, I think, is good shaping and good choices. And yes, I think Merlinomicon needed the nerf as well. And that's solid. That'll help burst mages from doing quite so much crazy stuff, which is a positive. Next up, Sunfire Cape. We're continuing sort of some buffs to Juggernauts and tanks. 150 gold off the item. Here is the cost analysis. Before you were spending 560 on the burn. Now you're only spending 417. That feels a bit more reasonable for what that item actually provides. It is 85% efficient on stats, as opposed to 80% efficient on stats. So you're at least fairly close on tankiness now without this. And when you consider comparing it to things like Randuin's Omen or Thornmail, where the unique passive on the item was actually tank stats, it was an attack speed slow or crit sort of damage reduction, you are straight up losing durability stats by buying this item. You are paying for the burn. You have to make that sacrifice, and so that sacrifice is a little bit less big, and I think that's kind of a good thing. Overall, these are two sets of changes that are pushing you more towards playing tankier champions and less towards playing assassins, which I think is, people are talking about how there's maybe a little bit too much damage, a little bit too much burst in the game. Well, if you're more willing to play Juggernaut Volibear with a Sunfire Cape, that's one less burst champion in the game trying to take you out. And one better chance to survive that Rengar because there's not also a top or mid pike or whatever trying to take you out. So that's kind of nice. Also, Volibear can peel by pressing E, which is kind of nice. Also, some selfish durability stats out here. Overheal slightly stronger. It's gonna self heal convert at higher levels, and it's gonna fall off much slower. That's a really quite big deal. It's gonna help it a lot for solo queue players to stay alive. Anyone who wants to use Blade of the Ruin King is gonna feel a lot better about this thing. But you don't get that crazy conversion off of a Soraka healing you, which honestly, that's fine. Take it or leave it. Didn't really need it so much. I'm kind of glad seeing that simplification. That seems pretty reasonable here. I think that's fine. One of the big things is Overheal was versus Triumph was really plateaued, or I would say tiered, solo queue versus pro, where solo queue has a lot more kills than pro does, and so Triumph did more heavy lifting, bridging that gap a little bit. I mean, Overheal is still getting, I would say, strictly buffed for pro, but they were already running it anyway, so whatever. Not honestly that big of a deal at the end of the day. And it means that these sort of ranged marksmen are going to be tankier overall. This honestly could end up as a very overtuned rune. I could easily see Overheal being kind of busted. And if that's the case, then, well, enjoy your Invincible Marksman meta, I guess. Also, a change to Legend Bloodline. And this is going to look on paper to a lot of people like a buff. I don't think it is, actually. What's interesting is Legend Bloodline is already actually really good. Like win rate wise, Bloodline was very competitive with Alacrity, but Alacrity was getting like 3-to-1 pick rate over it. So it's a change that's going to look really cool, but I think it's actually a nerf to the rune. So here's the table on how much lifesteal you're getting. And up until your 14th stack, it is weaker. From that point onwards, it is more lifesteal, and then you're kind of better off in the game. And eventually it's 50% more lifesteal. Getting 12% is quite a bit. But I don't know, it's 25% weaker for your first 10 stacks, and it finally catches up. I think it's a pretty meaningful haircut in how much it actually gives you and gives your character. And there's a decent chance that Bloodline loses win rate on most characters as a result, unless you're really going to farm quite well and get yourself safely to late game. It's even less so now a decent selfish option to say, okay, I need to survive this lane, I'll run Bloodline and lifesteal, because you're not going to get it stacked as fast. It's going to be less lifesteal for a long time. Might be weaker. Next up, there was a really good change, and I love this change to cut down. The bonus damage is going from percent max HP to flat max HP. Sorry, I revert that. It's going from flat max HP to percent max HP. The top end being a little bit weaker, but let's look at the data table. Here is, I chose Vayne as a champion who doesn't typically buy bonus HP. I said, okay, if you're running cut down, where do your breakpoints live now? So you'd get the minimum trigger at these health values with the flat 150 to onwards. This is now the new minimum threshold at the percent HP threshold. You can see here that it turns on 130 to 70 health sooner. Now, of course, the more health items you buy at a ratio of, as we bring it back up here, 10%. So if you buy 300 health worth of items, aka a Trinity Force, this gap lowers by 30, right? 10%. That gap lowers by 30. So really, unless you buy 700 health worth of items, the 4% is going to come in sooner. Now, the more max HP your champion natively has, and Vayne actually scales up to a decent amount, close to 2,000, which is, pretty reasonably high. That at a certain point, it can eventually be weaker, but it's going to be a while. So cut down is going to turn on sooner. As far as the sort of upper echelon, right, new cut down is going to cap at these values, at between 1,000 and about 4K. That is the new cap on when this turns on. And it stops at 10%. To get the old 10% damage, it took these numbers. And you can see here that for a substantial amount of difference in time, cut down is stronger. It turns on at the bottom sooner. 10% damage is on for most of the early through mid game. Eventually, late game, your character leveling up is going to eventually nerf cut down. It's not better in all cases always. The high-end damage, the old version of the rune, is better, but cut down is basically never optimal in almost any case ever. It seemingly never had a better win rate than like coup de grace. And I think this is definitely a buff to cut down in far more cases than it's a nerf. This is overall going to go up in win rate, and you should be really willing to try to play with cut down now, because this is a pretty substantial difference in power. It's going to be on a lot more often against a lot more targets for a lot more damage. Really big deal in my opinion. Absolute Focus getting tuned down a little bit from 3 to 24 becomes 1.8 to 18, or 5 to 40 becomes 3 to 30. Definitely a pretty big deal. 20 to 25% damage nerf. Actually, 40 to 25% stat nerf is a pretty big deal. We're getting pretty close to the part where you don't just run Sorcery because it gives you the most stats. Absolute Focus was, I think, definitely overtuned and really carrying Sorcery secondary by a lot. I'm kind of glad to be in a state where I feel like I don't have to run Absolute Focus anymore, where I can feel good going in Sorcery and taking a bunch of other stuff and not feel like I'm missing out on too much damage. One thing this will do, though, for... especially, I would say, physical damage marksman, is this nerf of up to almost 6 attack damage is actually a fairly big deal, especially if you just don't go focus at all. Keep in mind that a lot of sort of typical attack damage builds was only 1 attack damage item for a while. You were either going full Storm Razor into your rapid fire cannon, and so you're 6,000 gold in your build with only 1 damage item, or you're doing Infinity Edge into rapid fire cannon Shiv, and you're 3 items in, you're 9,000 gold in with still only 1 damage item. And it was nice to get some of that damage carried by your runes to kind of flesh out your stat profile. And if you're not going focus anymore, this is going to be a fairly substantial dip in total attack damage gained, but I think that's kind of okay. Next up, the adaptive damage is down by 1, armor up by 1, MR up by 2. I do want to point out that purely mathematically, gold value-wise, adaptive damage is still the highest stat here. You pay about as much per point of AP as you do per point of armor and MR. And so it's still actually the most raw gold in stats here, as far as just the pure gold value. But getting these numbers closer certainly is going to help. You'll be more likely when you're playing, Kassadin versus Talon or whatever, to run that 6 armor again, bridge the gap a little bit here. And as they're saying here in this context paragraph, that though the buffs and nerfs are pretty small, if you switch from 10 AP to 6 armor, that's a pretty substantial drop in the overall lethality of the game, which I think is true. More drops in lethality to the game. Ignite is going down a fair bit in damage. Here's this, 12 to 19% less Ignite damage. I want to point out this is a revert of, I want to say it was like 8.6 in the middle of last year. The goal was to kind of bribe people into taking Ignite over Teleport. They didn't have any effects in pro play, had some effects in solo queue. Eventually they finally went with the actual TP nerf if you can't channel. We're still going to see TP in every pro game because you're never going to not do that. But I'm glad to see this kind of revert come in, and you're going to have less fickle top lane matchups. That seems positive. Also, having 100 less damage in late game Ignite means you're more survivable. This seems like a good change. Later on, we're going to see Red Smite doing less damage as well, to a similar tune of 15%-ish. So those seem solid. But as recompense for Ignite, it is a lower cooldown. So it's up every 3 minutes. So you can still play that aggro Ignite user. I didn't bother to look at like DPS for this, but certainly you can go for a lot more all-ins. And at this point, this cooldown is basically half of what TP is, and you can kind of really go for this kind of stuff. You should still be able to play pretty aggressive because the nerf is smaller in the early game, and so only losing 20 damage, only losing 15%, you can still push people out of lane. Game pacing stuff. Early Baron is worth a lot less. It's no longer even linear. It's going to be sort of parabolic. And you can see here that instead of gaining 24 attack damage, which is 36 at 30, it's 12 attack damage, which is only 26 at 30. So here is the difference in Baron stats. I chose to do only AP, but it's the same sort of ratio for attack damage here, right? A lot less stats early game. Because of how frequently cannon minions were spawning in the mid game, it was very easy to take a 20 or 22 minute Baron, walk in with 2 cannon minions and just take way too much of the base. So now the champions that get this buff are getting a lot less stats as a result. They're getting a lot less out of it. They can still have the buffed up minions. That's still really, really powerful, but you are less insane at the team fight phase of this. So if you sneak a Baron, your opponents are more likely to fight you off, and up until 40 minutes, it's going to be weaker. And for a lot of this, pretty substantially so. This is a pretty significant hit, which is good because I think it was a little too good and ending games a little bit unfairly. The inhibitor Nexus turret's also just going to be quite a bit tankier, which is kind of nice. I actually would have rather, honestly, seen them all have 0 armor, like the outer turrets do when the turret plating falls, and just buff their health in comparison so that they have, 6,000 health at 0 armor as opposed to their, 3,500 at 70. It has some small knock-on effects for is lethality a good stat or whatever. So, okay, maybe you don't really want that, but I don't know. To me, it feels like I would rather have the health bar be representative and these PvE objectives all having true damage health bars. To me, that's a better choice. But whatever, it's a minor thing. It's a very finicky thing, but it's a UI thing that I think is just nice to have and whatever. Minor stuff. Okay, here's a big change. It wouldn't be a new season without changes to the jungle. So 2 changes. One, camps don't go up in value at levels 4 and 6. They wait until the odd levels. Also at levels 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, the XP is down a fair bit on all the camps. Here is the data table. The camps, when they spawn, are worth the same amount of XP. And the first respawn of the camp, when you go back in your jungle, these camps are only down about 3%. So a lot of people are going oh my gosh, the sky is falling. All I'm going to do is play level 2 ganking champions. It's well, your first clear is identical. And when you come back into the map, now it depends, right? Maybe this would have been a level 4 camp, not a level 3 camp. That could be true. Maybe characters leveled up enough that, when you come back in your jungle in about 4 to 5 minutes, these characters would have been higher level. Maybe they would have been level 4 monsters. In that case, yes, you're getting a 10% XP haircut on these camps. But if you're not, if they're coming in at 3, it's 3% off. It's not that big of a deal. But you're seeing this table, right? You're losing about 10% of what the camps are worth throughout the early game. And then when you're kind of 8 to 10 minutes onwards and just throughout the rest of the late game there, yeah, you're losing about 15% of the XP on the camps. Scuttlecraft a bit less so, but the buff camps and everything else, yeah, 13 to 15% off those camps by the late game. That is how much total XP, and that is counting the 50 bonus XP for having a jungle item. That is counting the changes of the small and the large camps together. All the above, all rolled in. I am pretty confident I did this math right. That is how much you are losing. Again, early jungle, barely affected. Later game hard farming, definitely affected. And this is going to really affect champions like Jax, who would actually just hard farm their jungle and get insane. It's going to affect you. It's going to affect Jack. It's going to affect Shyvana. The late game farming junglers are going to lose a fair bit here. But the first 4 levels, there are going to be points where you're going to miss a breakpoint. You're going to just barely miss that level. That's going to happen. That's true. But your first clear and probably your second clear, very little has changed. Just to point that out. This is all accounted for in all this stuff. Challenging Smite losing a little bit of damage. Here is the red smite damage difference, right? It's 20 to 23% overall off the red smite. Yep, this matters. This means a little bit. You're a little bit worse at dueling. And ultimately, yeah, I think players kind of saw, and the Riot design team said this as well, that the jungle role seems to be overtuned. They can fight too many people. The sort of goal with this, by the way, was they actually went back and looked at historical data. They went back and looked at season 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and said, okay, how much XP are junglers getting in this season compared to before? And after all the changes and getting rid of catch-up XP and getting rid of the penalty for being over-leveled, which by the way is of course a big deal, junglers started getting over-leveled from their historical norms in the previous seasons. And I want to say that regardless of what you think about jungle changes, I absolutely love that Riot is actually looking at the data of what the game used to be, and instead of using your instinctive levels of where are things, saying no. Jungle felt fair in their overall game impact back in, let's say, season 7, let's move the XP back to the levels of Season 7 and find that tuning that gets that line back where it was before using actual data. Because if you actually use numbers, right, if you actually look at what things were and get them back there, you can prevent yourself from inadvertently power creeping, inadvertently getting rid of tenets you used to have in the game, right? Again, I had that base stats video I put out earlier, either earlier this week or late last week, where I think like just over time, people lost sight of what these stats were supposed to accomplish. Now things are in weird spots to a little bit. Actually going back and saying, you know what? The game worked when Marksman came in a lane with 62 attack damage, or whatever the number is, right? Like whatever the numbers you actually thought it was. You know, the game worked when junglers got level 2 off one camp, but they didn't beat solo laners to level 6. The game worked really well when they had as much XP as the AD carry in pro games, but not more than them. So, and you rein that in, I think that approach is really good. Now, you might disagree on where the numbers are exactly, and that might be fair criticism, but the idea of targeting historical points, I think, is really good. Okay. Big thing of bug fixes. I'm not going to really go through this too much. Upcoming skins, that's awesome. That's super cool. Chromas as well. That's beautiful stuff. That is the end of the patch. So, up to the top, as we scroll and scroll and scroll through a very long patch, it's time for the TLDR of 9.2. New champions, new rank season, all that super awesome. Let's get into Aatrox. A pretty substantial cut to his damage, the tune of about 10 to 15% overall. Pretty substantial hit. He's going to be a lot weaker, and Aatrox could use it. Aurelion Sol, probably in too weak of a spot for him. He's not losing games so much, but I feel like he's a champion who can sit above 50 comfortably. Getting some really nice usability on the Q to stun short-range targets. That's going to be nice. Brand certainly far overtuned in the support role, losing a lot of damage on the burn. That's going to be really, really nice. He's still going to be on the strong side, but good to see this nerf. Cassiopeia also far, far too strong. Maxing W second is going to be quite a bit weaker. She's still going to be a little bit too strong as well. Galliel using some fairly substantial mana costs on the Q, damage on the Q, ratio on the Q, ratio on the Q, damage on the E. He's still going to be on the strong side. He's still going to be probably 80% pick ban in pro. But I do think the idea of the changes to bridge the gap between pro and solo queue, I think that part was successful, but he's still going to be a bit overtuned. That's my instinct. Irelia is already really, really weak in solo queue as far as the average play is concerned. Still a pretty solid overall pro pick, but is losing some wave clear damage overall. This is going to matter from level 3 onwards. Well, I guess I should say level 4 onwards, but it's rank 2 on the ability. She's going to have less wave clear. You're going to see some missed resets. She's going to clear minions less quickly and be stuck in lane a little bit longer. R is going to feel better to fight against, so I'm not sure R is specifically weaker. Yes, losing the disarm can matter, but the slow is better, this damage is better. I can easily see the R actually being buffed as a result, and I think that's fine. It being less frustrating with the disarm is a good choice in my opinion. 5% more attack speed on Jarvan is going to be nice. He's already in a decent spot, but he'll gain a bit and be a little bit stronger. He's going to be worth playing. Jax, honestly, people love to ban him in solo queue, but there's enough bad Jaxes out there that I think you can let him through the ban phase and let the bad Jaxes be bad at Jax. I think it's going to be okay. Either way, these nerfs are bigger than people are giving him credit for. This will move the needle quite a bit. Casting losing armor is going to make physical damage counterpicks better against him, losing flat armor and some armor growth. He will be very squishy against physical damage. He's going to need that arm guard earlier on in that build. Cain getting a lot of nice quality of life and usability on the passive. I think this will buff the champion quite a bit. I think Cain is going to be very strong coming in at 9.2. Niko getting some small usability on the W, getting some small tweaks to the R. I think she'll still be a slightly weak mid laner, but I think if you're good at her, you'll still be viable and effective with a champion. This seems to be a character that is going to reward your attention to the character. And if you are tricky enough, you can make her work, but she is, I would say, not a good support. Don't play her support. She's not good there. Don't do it. Don't be bad. Don't play her support. Ornn needs the buffs. He's still going to be on the weak side for solo queue. Might see him in pro now, but these are pretty substantial durability increases. But he will still be far sub 50 in solo queue. Rakan was already sub 50 and getting mostly nerfed, making his W easier to dodge at max range to get away from it, either walking away or spell shielding or blinking or something else. But overall is going to probably lose out on win rate. Still be played in pro. Going to be really weak in solo queue. Shyvana getting some nice small buffs. She was on the cusp of being fine in solo queue. We're not going to still see her in pro, but that's okay. I think Shyvana will be just fine in solo queue and totally worth playing. That's my opinion. Tahm Kench getting a mostly pro-focused nerf to his ultimate. You can't use it if you are in combat to get out. You'll still see him some in pro, but he's going to go down and down in priority. That's a good thing. Urgot will probably hit sub 50% win rate in solo queue as a result of all these changes. He's going to be really, really much more open to being attacked in the early game, and that is a good thing. Volibear getting some pretty substantial buffs to how much damage his E does. At certain points, it's going to be almost like 90 to 100 extra damage on the ability with these changes where they are now in the mid game. I think Volibear can easily be above 50% win rate. Some nice usability on the R as well. Volibear, I think, is going to be worth playing top jungle and support in the right matchups. He's going to be a terror in 9.2, I believe it. Yorick is doing okay-ish, is going to get some small usability buffs. More Graves going to spawn in the mid to late game. Bug fix on the E. And the Maiden of the Mist is going to be tankier in the mid to late game. Plus, you can send her down the side lane. She and the Ghoul is going to do full damage. Yorick's going to gain a solid 1 to 2% win rate off this. Zyra definitely broken, losing some mana regen. Going to remain overpowered. Pick or ban her every game. Small bug fixes and nice quality life stuff too. Evelyn's going to buff her a little bit. She's in an okay spot, but could use these. Going to gain a little bit. Going to be a strong champion. If you like playing Evelyn, she'll be worth playing in the season. This already happened with Kled. Don't worry about it. Oblivion Orb and Merlamicon getting some nerfs, which are going to nerf some of those like mid-game power spike junglers who try to assassinate you right away. That's going to be kind of nice. This will bring up the rise of some more physical damage mid laners because there's a nerf to, strict nerf to AP items in the mid lane here. But yeah, and you might have to think a little bit more about whether or not you want to play these magic band items in the mid lane because they are a little bit weaker, but they're still going to be on the strong side and totally worth playing. Sunfire Cape going up in efficiency. You are still paying solid gold for the actual burn aura effect here, but it being a little bit cheaper maybe means you want to play those, that Ornn, that Poppy a little bit more often, and you might see those bruiser champions a bit more in that top lane, and I think that's a good thing overall as well. Overheal looks like it's going to be nuts and really, really worth playing in solo queue, especially if you're a Blade of the Rune King user, or if you really want to play Legend Bloodline. Bloodline's losing a lot of power in the early game. It's going to take a long time till it catches up with its own power level, but it eventually stacks to higher and can be your only source of lifesteal in the late game. At 12%, that's really, really noticeable. Cut down is substantially better as well, especially in the early game. When you have less health, turns out a percent health scaler is a big deal. Is actually going to be weaker in the late game in a lot of cases, but is going to be a lot stronger in the early through mid game, and I think is really going to be worth picking up in a lot of cases here. Cut down is probably going to be my new go-to precision rune if we're going to play it against at least 2 tanks. If like the enemy team is Rengar top Kha'Zix, then no, but if there's tanks, I'm going to be running cut down a lot. Nerf's Absolute Focus means you might unlock some of those sorcery secondaries from people, give some more viable options out there. Definitely, this was an overtuned rune. Glad to see it going down. Adaptive damage going down, armor and MR going up. This is still going to be the most gold-efficient rune, but you'll be more willing to pick the defensive option here if you're playing Fizz against Lucian or, Yasuo bot lane against double mage down there. That's going to be helpful, and so, it's nice to get some slightly more defensive options out there, which should be good. Ignite losing about 15-20% of its damage is going to help with getting assassinated. Hand of Baron weaker in the early game when you pick it up right away. These are pretty substantial cuts to what it gives. You can team fight teams who have Baron a little bit more easily. Speaking of mid-game sieges, a bit more durability on the inhibitor and Nexus turret, so those actual base cracks aren't going to be quite as good. Jungler is going to get about 15% less XP in the late game, but the first few respawns are going to be barely noticeable. The first spawn of the jungle is exactly the same. The second spawn of the jungle is only going to be down maybe 3 to 5% in overall value. Not going to be that big of a deal. People always look at this last number and go, oh my gosh, lost so much, but it spawns at full value still, and the first tick of the jungle is not going to be that big of a deal either. Finally, Challenging Smite going down about 20% in damage as well. That is going to be fairly meaningful for junglers dueling you. That's going to be nice to see. And that's the patch. 9.2 is the start of the ranked season. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be week 2 of LCS, week 3 of LCK. It's going to be awesome. Sorry, week 3 of LEC, but I think also LCK. It depends when the weeks start. They're always a little bit finicky. Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.